All right, a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join what I think is going to be just a really, really fun conversation. We're going to have a fun panel discussion first. Then we'll invite all of you to ask questions to the panelists. After that, it gets even better because there's going to be even more food and even better food out there and more opportunities to discuss these fascinating topics that we have here. So let me first just introduce the wonderful panelists that we have with us here. So Steven Pinker really needs absolutely no introduction. He works over at the evil empire at Harvard, but you actually used to be on the right side.
21 years.
Yeah, here at MIT until he defected. Yeah, but you're always welcome back. Exactly.
Thank you.
And in addition to having, of course, written enormous amounts of interesting things that are very pertinent to what we're going to talk about tonight, one thing I really admire about you, Steve, is you don't just talk the talk, you actually walk the walk. You actually care deeply about some of these issues and are willing to actually stand up for them even when it's not popular. And I tip my hat to you for that. And then we have David Taylor, who has written this amazing new biography of George Orwell. And afterwards, we even have a bunch of copies that you can take with you home with his signature if you're lucky. We have so we'll get back to how that works at the end. Really wonderful to have you flying all the way over from England for this.
It's really wonderful to be here in such distinguished company.
Welcome. You're here inspecting the colonies.
Yes, we did. My colleague Jeremy and I did do the tour yesterday morning, and I emailed my wife and said, yeah, it's great, and every sign you see goes on about the villainous redcoats and how they were firmly trounced here by Colonel Magruder's militia, but it's fine, you know.
Well, you should know that in the town of Winchester, Massachusetts, just where my wife and I live, there is a little sign right in the middle of Winchester, where it says, this was the site of the very first house of Winchester, built by John Converse, who was thrown in jail, this was in the 1600s, for speaking disrespectfully of the king's letter.
Oh, quite right.
Yeah. So, and then before we introduce Jean here, do you want to just all three of you stand up here? Because we have we have the wonderful Orwell Foundation joining us from Britain. Do you want to say very super quickly who you are? Just your names, and then Jean can tell us more about the foundation. Do you want to say your name?
Yeah, I'm Liz Wallace. I'm the Deputy Director of the Foundation, so I work with the fabulous Jean Seaton.
Hi, I'm Kathy Harvey. I'm a trustee of the Orwell Foundation, and I work at Oxford University, so I'm visiting MIT while I'm here. But really, I'm having a good time being with my friends from the Orwell Foundation and supporting this. And thank you, Max, for hosting.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And thank you, Christine, as well, who's behind the scenes, who's made all this happen. Thank you all.
Where are you? And did you
I'm Jeremy, and I work with Liz and Jean at the Orwell Foundation doing our communications, which is quite Orwellian, the Orwell Foundation.
Yes. And last but not least, larger than life, we have the great pleasure of we have the very, very great pleasure of having Jean Seaton with us here. She's a professor of media history at Westminster University, and also the head of the Orwell Foundation. Do you want to just tell us just a little bit about what the Orwell Foundation is?
Yes. So, hi. Thank you very much for asking us. I just think I need to put down a footprint in America. I have a direct relationship to Rebecca Nurse, who was the third witch who was hung at Salem. The indisputably not a witch. No, I do have so you can make that what you will. The Orwell Foundation was set up by the first biographer of Orwell, in a way, Bernard Crick, and we've grown it a great deal since then. And it does three things. It tries to make people look at and interrogate and ask questions about what Orwell wrote, and actually and read it and think about it and have interesting thoughts about it. And secondly, we may not manage to do that, but we try very much to take his values and interests in journalism, language, integrity, wars, writing, novels, the whole shebang, into now. We try and make those things alive by asking awkward questions, being a platform for awkward debates. And the third thing I think we do is try and take some of those things out in a slightly different way, particularly to young people. So we give journalism prizes, we give writing prizes, all of which try and make that which is good get attention in the very noisy modern world. But we also encourage lots and lots of young people to begin to write and think about language and politics with a kind of clarity and skepticism. So that's what we do.
Thank you so much for that, Jean. And what you said there about connecting then and now, I think is the perfect springboard from which to dive into the conversation here. Because, of course, when you think about what happens to famous authors, some of them are very famous and then quickly fade. George Orwell was not one of those authors. Indeed, things that he is so associated with, for example, from 1984, like censorship, surveillance, and hate-mongering, feels like it's just every bit as relevant as back in his day. And some might even argue that it's getting even more relevant. So I thought we could start talking a little bit about those three, censorship first. If we begin in the present, Steve, do you want to say a few words about your take on whether this is actually becoming more of a pressing issue in America and the West, and any reflections on that?
Well, there's certainly, ironically, on university campuses, censorship is increasing, and this can be quantified. And I say this as, you refer to my employer as the evil empire, and the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression might even actually ratify that, because in their ranking of 248 American universities in terms of freedom of expression, Harvard came in last place with a score of 0, and that's because they put a floor on the scale of 0, otherwise we would have come in at -10. So we were 2 standard deviations below the second to worst finisher. So this is a dubious distinction, but it isn't just Harvard. There have been more firings, more sanctions, more incidents of censorship over the last 10 years than there was during the McCarthy era. So it is, the sensation that it's getting worse is, at least on college campuses, is not unfounded, even though in other media, like social media, there's a complaint, there's too much speech. But ironically, in the forum one would think would be designed to express and evaluate ideas, things have gotten worse. And there are attempts to rewrite the past, as Orwell warned about in his The Memory Hole in the Ministry of Truth, such as expunging articles from journals when they express an unpopular opinion, not just a scientific error, but some opinion that is deemed to be too sympathetic to colonialism, or at least not critical enough, or that claims that there are 2 sexes, or violates a number of heresies that result not just in criticism, which would be a good thing, but an actual expungement, as in the memory hole. Now, I think that this is I often get asked the question, why, what's happening? Why is this getting, appear to be getting worse? How can we explain this madness? The way I think about it, and this is, I think, consistent with Orwell's approach, is that it's actually quite natural to repress opinions that disagree with one's own, that it's very intuitive to think that people who disagree with me are subversive, are spreading falsehoods, are a danger, and ought to be repressed for the greater good. In contrast, the ideal of free speech, that no matter how much I disagree with someone, For all I know, he might be right. I'm not infallible, and therefore we need a system or a regime in which free speech is protected. That's a deeply weird concept in human history. We naturally regress toward repression of speech and ideas, and it's, I don't want to say a Sisyphean battle, but it is a constant battle to reaffirm the value of free speech given our psychology, which naturally regresses toward repression of speech we disagree with.
Very interesting. Just I have to inject some humility here as a representative of MIT. Even though I'm honor bound, of course, at every opportunity to make fun of Harvard, it's part of my loyalty oath I had to sign for the job. The truth is, we had a faculty meeting shortly after Dorian Abbott was canceled here to come give an astrophysics talk because of something he had written in Time magazine, which was about something else. And Lily Tsai, who's our chair of the faculty, asked in a Zoom poll us professors if we were sometimes afraid of saying what we thought. 60% of the MIT professors said yes on this. It's pretty shocking numbers. So it's not just Harvard. I wanted to ask you, Gene, a related question here. At MIT, we're always obsessed about mechanisms and engineering and how does something work. So if you look at the mechanisms of censorship, the process of it, you have some thoughts about that you want to share?
Well, I suppose I would say I would completely agree with Stephen. If I can just say so from Britain, I think that there will be a series of topics that people would hesitate to speak about in classrooms or hesitate to speak about in meetings. So I think there's also something that's happened around academic life, which is you used to be in a kind of private space, actually, with people you trusted, and now that's also gone. So I think what censorship does, and Orwell's very, very good on self-censorship. It's the system of censorship that you feel it's necessary to obey because of consequences. Now, the consequences to me or you at MIT or a British university are actually very, very tiny. Nobody's going to come and cut our heads off yet. But nevertheless, a very small amount of fear can lead to huge amounts of hesitation. And so I think that one of the things that Orwell talks about is that censorship comes in big systems and they're arbitrary. I mean, one of the things he says somewhere is that, you require censorship in order to get a kind of obedience, but it's not fixed. Censorship doesn't fix itself because, in a sense, it can flip things. And I think that's very interesting as we look at the current moment, because you tend to see new things that are being censored as it were, merely novelty. And the censorship is coming from different groups with different powers behind them. So I think censorship is nearly always a system, and any individual in it is sort of grappling with it and not knowing the rules. Whereas Orwell's quite, in 1984, sort of you know the rules. And the moment Winston Smith buys himself a journal to keep a secret journal, to keep a diary, then he's asserting consciousness of his own against censorship. And I think that the really interesting thing about censorship is it attempts to control consciousness, and we seem to have more tools to control consciousness perhaps than we used to.
Very interesting. So I have a question for all of you actually in the audience, which is the same question that our faculty chair asked us. So let's do just a quick show of hands. I'm curious, have you at some point in the last year, say, or two, caught yourself biting your tongue or just felt a bit worried about expressing your opinion? Raise your hand if that's true. Put them all the way up so we can see properly. Okay, and those of you who had a clear no here, can you put your hands up? And then those of you who are like, I'm not sure whether I should raise my hand or not. That's pretty overwhelming, yeah. And so it's not just for us, yeah. So I have a question then for you, David, about this. The fact that, so I'm really intrigued. You know, when I was reading 1984, I really started wondering about George Orwell, the person. What was it that made him so interested in these questions and have such deep insights about it?
I think it goes deep back into his psychology in a way that sort of predates what one would call his political awakening. And what I mean by that is that Animal Farm in 1984, his two great novels, are intensely political tracts, you know, with enormous relevance today. In fact, I was speaking to a gentleman who's here this evening beforehand who came from Myanmar, who said that, you know, how Orwell was regarded as a prophet, and his three novels, Burmese Days, Animal Farm in 1984, were seen as a kind of trilogy that explained the current situation in what was formerly Burma when Orwell was there. And what I mean by all this predating his political awareness, I mean, it's generally held, it's a view I would take, that Orwell's view of the world politically was pretty much forged in the Spanish Civil War, where he fought on the Republic as a volunteer for the Republican side against the fascist General Franco. And it was then this crystallized his notions, particularly of what propaganda could do, the baleful uses to which totalitarian regimes could put propaganda. But this is in 1937. And the interesting thing about Orwell's 6 novels, and 3 of them predate his going to Spain in 1937, he wrote 3 books before that, is that the plots and the situational dilemmas that face the characters in all 6 books, all 6 novels, are exactly the same. They're all about frightened solitaries on whom the exterior world is looming in and oppressing. People struggling. All of Orwell's 6 novels, from the very first Burmese Days to the very last 1984, are about tiny acts of rebellion that fail and are crushed. And the hero, or in one case the heroine, go back to being the kind of people they were at the beginning. So they're entirely circular. And so obviously the Orwell's view, I suppose, of the human mind goes way back to the early days. And my own opinion would be that a lot of it was forged serving the British Raj, as a colonial police officer in what was then Burma in the 1920s. And there were some very curious letters that have not survived, which he wrote back to friends saying that he thought that he was being spied on. He thought his letters were being opened. He thought that there were things that he could not say. And in fact, there's a paragraph in Burmese Days, which was first published as long ago as 1934, which essentially sets out what he describes the colonial regime in Burma, but you could transpose it to the regime of 1984 without too much trouble. So I think the seeds of all this were sown a long way back, way before he really began to concentrate on the idea of international power politics and some of their implications for things like surveillance, technology, and censorship.
It's very interesting how the similarities you see then between back then and now. And which leads me to another question. If we look at censorship throughout the last 100 years or so, it's quite interesting how the groups of people who complain about it vary quite a lot over time. So for example, today in America, we hear a lot of people on the political right complaining about censorship, whereas during the McCarthy period in the 1950s in America, who was complaining mostly about censorship? It was mostly people on the American left. And I was actually quite struck in this MIT faculty poll I mentioned, and in the discussions we had afterwards, to notice there's a very strong pattern which MIT professors were afraid of speaking their mind and felt censorship was a problem, and which were not. The ones who were most concerned were from Iran, from China, from Eastern Europe, or actually from Europe more generally, where memories of how bad it can go are still rather fresh. And also Americans, the older faculty, who remembered the McCarthy era. That was my interpretation. And the ones who were least concerned were young American faculty. So I'm very curious. if any one of you has any thoughts about what are the commonalities of how censorship plays out, across the political spectrum. In other words, if we can separate out all the contentious political stuff that people get angry about from the basic mechanisms.
I think that's a very good point about the way in which where the pressure comes from, and in fact, the whole thing's particular. There was a great English novelist who probably a lot of people in this room won't have heard of, called Malcolm Bradbury. I'm sure Stephen's heard of him. Yeah, Malcolm Bradbury used to be at the UEA. No, he wrote a wonderful novel called The History Man in the 1970s, which is set on a campus and which is about exactly this. It's about a warring faculty. It's about inviting guest speakers who may be thought to have curious views about race and must therefore be cancelled. And it's the kind of book and this is written in 1975, and it's the kind of book where a left-wing member of the faculty will say, we cannot tolerate ... And then the elderly Jewish emigre language specialist says, but that is precisely what we must do. We must tolerate. And in every Bradbury novel set in a university, there is usually some emigre Russian or someone from Eastern Europe who knows that these issues are these are really serious things. And that they have a grounding way back in the convolutions of European and Western history. And this was written 50 years ago. And as you say, then it's coming from the left. These days, a lot of the complaints against censorship seem to be coming from the right. And it's interesting how Orwell, it's interesting to me personally, as a biographer of Orwell who gets his book reviewed in American newspapers, it is fascinating to me now how Orwell is being used as a stick by the American right to beat what we'll call progressive forces. Do you find this? Is this a
yes, but there is an asymmetry, and again, I'll advert to the statistics from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, that among all of the incidents of censorship and punishment that they have cataloged, the ones coming from within universities are overwhelmingly from the left, 70 to 80%. The ones coming from outside the universities are majority from the right. That is, legislatures, alumni, donors. I remember when I was here, the president of MIT at the time, Chuck Vest, said jokingly, well, every week or so I get a letter from an enraged alumnus or donor telling me to fire Noam Chomsky. But those are the pressures from outside. And of course, we're seeing that in kind of ham-fisted legislation from Florida and from Texas. But from inside the university, it's overwhelmingly from the left. And you're right, of course, that historically it wasn't always this way. The Berkeley free speech movement in 1964 was from the left. Of course, the movement of the censorship of pacifist sentiments in the First World War, the even earlier women's suffrage and abolitionism were viciously repressed by the government, and it was free speech advocates who were champions of these progressive causes. Civil rights in the 1960s, gay rights. So there is a turn probably starting around in the 1990s.
Same thing with Orwell himself too. I mean, Orwell in the late 1940s became much less interested in what we'll call formal structures of governments and how they operated than in individual cases and what he called and he was a great supporter of the Freedom Defence Committee was his big thing in the 1940s, and it was against press censorship. They wanted to ensure that low circulation but contentious papers with titles like Peace News was still allowed to be published, as the Cold War was beginning.
Can I ask you a question about Orwell's intellectual development? But I get the feeling that from a lot of the tropes, the allusions, the symbolism, both in 1984, but especially in Animal Farm, were kind of thinly disguised satires of the Soviet Union in particular. And I got the sense, and this is something that I'd be curious for your professional opinion on, that he was, like many socialists of the 30s, idealistic socialists, disillusioned by the Stalin's repression and gulags, and that some of the motivation in terms of answering the question that was raised earlier, why did Orwell become political in the way that he did might have been the disillusionment, like, oh my God, what happened to the causes that I initially supported, especially from the left, and how did they turn into this nightmare in the Soviet Union?
That's interesting. Orwell always maintained, as one of the fascinations of writing this new biography, was I turned up some letters written from the early 1930s, at a point when Britain was politically very divided and Europe itself was going the same way, where Orwell maintains to one of his girlfriends that he didn't know anything about politics and wasn't really interested in it. He then later says that although he always sort of kept an eye on what was happening in the Soviet Union and thought that by about 1932 he was pretty sure that it was the God that failed, to use the title of a famous book that then sort of excoriated the Soviet regime, and it's after that his mind began. And but it's not until as late as sort of 1946 that he starts reading some of the key Soviet texts. Like there's a novel by Evgeny Zamyatin called "We," which is it's the first Soviet satire of the Soviet Union, written in the early 1920s. But the fascination of all this, and on one level I agree with you that there's a romantic side to his socialism, but there's also a deeply materialistic side. And he said after the Second World War, when a Labour government was finally elected with a mandate for reform, he said that the one thing that you couldn't blame the working classes for was their materialism, because previous to that they'd had nothing, so they were entitled to want something. But there's a tension in all of this, and I'd be interested to get your views on this, which is that although he described himself as since 1936 a democratic small d, socialist big S, but it was truly said by a friend of his, the novelist Anthony Pohl, that Orwell was a conservative in everything except politics. And this, if that's actually arguable, if we can tolerate this kind of compartmentalization. But what that meant, that the progressive sort of forward-looking views that he espouses politically are always being tempered and sort of held up by the fact that he is basically an English gentleman from a bygone era who believes in a kind of almost 19th century vision of Seaton. He once wrote this marvelous poem that begins, "A happy vicar I might have been 200 years ago," which in some ways was his kind of ideal state. And he says somewhere in one of his essays that in a less politicized world, he was quite happy to have been a quietist. To have just.
Yeah,
so I think this tension between the conservative and the radical side, or what makes him so interesting to me as a writer.
Yeah, fascinating. Before we're going to switch to surveillance and hate in a moment, but first, he specifically said he would love to hear your opinion on one angle there. Do you want to share something, a brief remark, Steve?
That hadn't occurred to me until I made a connection with the essay that I reread today in preparation for this event that I've read multiple times, namely Politics in the English Language, which is filled with, it's a mixture of insight and good advice and utter nonsense.
Indeed, that's...
And a lot of the nonsense does come from a kind of curmudgeonly, graybeard, temperamental conservative attitude. The young people are ruining the language. It all used to be better. Everything is going downhill. It was better in the good old days. And for someone with such an analytical mind, it was surprising to see both a lack of historical awareness, namely, in every period, people think the language is deteriorating, but he couldn't escape the trap of thinking that right now it was not as good as when he was...
exactly, and there's that famous phrase that good prose is like a window pane. Well, I'm here to tell you that a lot of good prose is not like a window pane, and some is a lot of the good prose that Orwell liked himself. It's just one of his apophthegms, isn't it?
But one felt in reading it that he was mourning a bygone era, clouding his obvious mental brain power.
I would agree with that.
Fascinating. Speaking of clouding things over, and then using other means to see what's going on there, surveillance, of course, is another theme in 1984, which there's a lot of angst around these days. Can we do another quick show of hands? Who here has at some point felt that there's a little bit too much creepy surveillance? So, I'm curious if any of the three of you, actually what I'm going to save you for last, David, but if you, Gene, or you, Stephen, have any comments about surveillance today in our modern society.
Well, I think I'd just like to say things. It like nearly all systems, it depends who runs them. Surveillance isn't the same thing. It depends what are the values behind it and for what purposes. Mm-hmm. So a bit controversial. Surveillance keeps bits of cities safe, and that's fine. But the same mechanisms are used in repressive societies to stop young women taking head things off in Iran off their head things, or in goodness knows what in China. So I think the potential of surveillance is one thing, but the values and the governance of it, and I think that are another thing. So I actually don't think there is one thing called surveillance. Mm-hmm. There's a technology, like all technologies. It really depends how it's governed, how it's managed, what its purpose is, who uses it, what the privacy thing. So I think surveillance in itself is just one thing. But I do think that, I wouldn't, when you think of the, how you would be a dissident in some societies now, then 1984 raises all sorts of really interesting things, because you're always calculating, you're always addressing, you're always hesitating, you're always double thinking, as it were. Double thinking is a very interesting word, I think, because we see it as a pejorative, but I think actually it's also what you do if you're in a repressive system. You have to think through what you do. So I think surveillance has potential enormous terrors, and of course we're all surveyed. Every time we use this, we give off data, which we give away for free, and that's the surveillance which is not governed by a state or in our interest, but is sold. So surveillance is a very sort of complicated topic, is all I would say. It's more complicated than it looks.
Do you want to add something to that, Steve?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm just delighted to hear that, because I think a lot of the concerns about surveillance really are misplaced. So, I use Google, I use Google Maps. I'm very glad that I don't have to pay a nickel every time I look up something on Google or get guidance from Google Maps. And in exchange, they harvest my searches, and so if I Google tires, then I get a bunch of ads for tires. And that can be annoying, but it's a price that probably everyone, if offered, is willing to pay instead of having to pay per use of Google. It's just probably an enormous public good. On the other hand, and I agree that it's the problematic part is when it is used by authorities to suppress debate, conversation, exploration of ideas, forcing people into the doublethink and contracting the space of privacy. So again, I'll give a concrete example from my own university. A number of years ago, there was a discussion in an email group among a bunch of law students, and one of the students said, well, it seems to me that the possibility of racial differences, it's not completely incoherent. It may be false, but we should acknowledge that at least it's conceivable. And I'm just raising this as a possibility. I'm not endorsing it. Please don't do a Larry Summers on me. Well, they did a Larry Summers on her. That is, one of her fellow students who was involved in a love triangle outed her to the dean of the law school, who then publicly shamed her. That is, held up this private email, forced her into a groveling apology as she became the target of a kind of almost like a 2 minutes hate, with the result that she and students afterwards have to realize that not even a confidential discussion in an email group with your fellow students is beneath the notice of people with real power, like the dean of a law school in which you are a student. And that the mechanism of public shaming could be used to make sure that no heretical thought is even entertained, let alone advocated. That worries me much more than Google feeding me ads for tires.
Fascinating. So, of course, so much of the surveillance that we are subject to now, whether it's by companies who, so just the other day I learned that the Chrome browser, who used the Chrome browser? has started sending all your browser history to Google by default. And if you go into the settings, you can actually opt out of it, but they never let you opt in. They just sort of quietly did it. And then they can also sell it, of course, to other companies and who knows what. There's on the one hand that, and then there's things that authorities can do, like what Edward Snowden blew the whistle on. All of that's enabled by modern technology that wasn't around in 1948. So can you say a little bit about what you think made George Orwell so interested in surveillance?
Well, I find the whole technological. I have no scientific training, by the way. I abased myself before you because I gave up. I did a year. I studied physics for a year and gave it up in 1974, thinking it was the worst thing I'd ever done in my life. But let us disregard all that, But the role that technology plays in 1984 is, to me, fascinating because it's. I know there are the telescreen. There's obviously the telescreen, the Orwell's great sort of symbolic, prying window into men's souls, to adapt a remark by John Milton, a line in one of Milton's essays. But his interest in technology, it seems to me, is almost entirely abstract. And although you have the telescreen, or although there are supposedly these microphones that hang out, above your heads in the street, and Julia is always warning Winston, don't say that the streets probably might, and you think, well, how? How does this work? Because Orwell never says. Theoretically, given the fact that you surmise that at almost any given time somebody is watching you, somebody personally watching you from behind this telescreen, it seems to me that half the population of Oceania must be watching the other half when they go about their daily business. And you think, how do the microphones work? I mean, when you walk down a street, how can they listen to you? Is it hanging above your head? Is it attached to the wing of some pigeon that's flowing? And so he doesn't know about technology at all. And he was, in fact, practically, his knowledge of science was useless. I mean, he could never work out how you could travel by train through parts of England run by different train companies, and why the different gauges didn't stop the trains from working. So he's a scientific illiterate in some ways, but technology plays this immensely powerful role in 1984. And the interesting thing is that we were talking just now, Jean and Stephen, about the sources of oppression, and if we think that we live in an increasingly totalitarian world, when who are the totalitarians and where are they coming from and what are they doing? One of the influences on 1984 is a book by the American management theorist James Burnham. And Orwell wrote a fascinating essay called James Burnham and the Managerial Revolution in 1946, which feeds into 1984. And the point that Orwell makes at the end of this, and remember, this was written in 1946, just after the end of the Second World War, and the three great territorial powers have divided up the world. The Cold War, a phrase which Orwell himself invented, is about to begin. And Orwell says at the end of this essay, he says, the future is not going to be like now. In the future, people will not be oppressed by generals and military strategists. They will be oppressed by the managerial and the technical classes. It's technology that's, it's the technocrats who are going to be the authoritarians of the future. That's one of the great deductions to me of 1984.
Very prescient. Yeah, fascinating.
Well, it's certainly true that on university campuses, a lot of the repression and punishment doesn't come from the actual authorities in the sense of the deans, the provosts, the presidents, but it comes from this burgeoning bureaucracy. I don't know if you want to call them technocrats. They certainly don't command an arsenal of technology, but it's people that no one can quite figure out who they get their mandate from. And a lot of the repression, the mandatory diversity statements, the censuring, the punishment of heretical ideas under the guise of harassment are enforced by this middle level of management.
That's so true. Yeah, like one time a professor in my department sent me this PowerPoint presentation where it said that when we do graduate admissions, we're no longer allowed to look at which university the student came from. So if it's University of Idaho or Harvard, we're not supposed to know that. And I wrote to our president and asked, "Is this for real?" But most interestingly of all, it wasn't coming from any sort of official place. It was someone in some training program that created this, and then it
Human resources.
yeah. So this is a great segue into. So we talked about censorship for quite a while, and we talked about surveillance for a bit now, into hate mongering. We live in a world, obviously, where for whatever reason we see more and more hate, both within countries, between groups, and also between countries, and. Jean, you were commenting earlier on very interesting dynamics of Samuel Goldstein and how the 2 minutes of hate gets implemented today. Sometimes, do you want to share a little bit?
If you haven't read it, the 2 minutes hate sequence in 1984 is kind of foundational Orwell, because one of Orwell's extraordinary capacities was self-excoriating. I mean, most of us, all of us, certainly me, would like to think well of themselves, and Orwell's capacity to think badly of himself is almost limitless, and so there must be a limit, there must be something else going on. And then the 2 minutes hate, the Winston Smith goes he's very bored. You have to do it. It's part of the requirements of the state. But he finds himself watching these movies, sort of moved into hate. And what's so compelling about that is that it's about being a member of a mob. But of course, online, people very easily get to be members of mobs. And I mean, I think what we haven't talked about is the self-righteousness of groups that agree with censorship as it goes by. So all of the movements that Stephen was mentioning, they felt that, there's censorship that comes from somewhere else, there's propaganda, which is meant to undermine our systems, that comes from somewhere else. I understand all of that. But there's also terrible riots of self-righteousness, and censorship seems to me is very related. That the kind of censorship we're talking now, that Stephen was talking about, is really as much about a sort of a festival, a riot of puritanical self-righteousness, which then gets paid out. And the only other thing I'd say is that 2 minutes hate and censorship, if in East Germany, when the wall came down, I think nearly 2/3 of people were in the Stasi and were actually reporting on their neighbours. So that surveillance, self-righteousness, protecting yourself and hating others can be sequenced by a system in a way that's really very, very profound, as it was. And stepping out of that is really difficult. It's very, very difficult. There's a wonderful book that something came to mind. It's not by Orwell, by Robert Darnton, who's a great historian. It's called The Great Cat Massacre. And it's about lots of, he also wrote about pornography in the French Revolution, and more or less shows that pornographic images of the royalty really were effective. And of course there was unfairness. But The Great Cat Massacre is, cats become seen as evil things by apprentices, and they massacre all of the cats. So the massacring of the cats and the 2 minutes hate, and if you got on the wrong side, leaving aside justice, there is no defense if you're in the middle of a social media storm. And increasingly, mere evidence, the things that are really happening, it's very difficult to get leverage for evidence when one of these great storms is running. It's no good saying it wasn't like that, or it was more nuanced, or this is the evidence and the facts show this, because the thing has run away. So that's what I'd say about 2 minutes hate. We live in a period that does seem to me different, actually. We've in a sense said there's been censorship at all times, there's been outrage at all times. I think that's right. I think in our societies, 2 minutes hate feels a bit more close than it has ever done before in my life, anyway.
Stephen?
No, it is a fascinating phenomenon that somehow technology enables but is not necessary for, which is the common knowledge demonization and shaming of a scapegoat as a means of bonding a community, but also as a kind of mob psychology where people join in out of fear of being denounced if they don't. Like the kids who kind of torment the clumsy kid, not so much because they hate him, but they feel that if they fail to, they'll be bullied next. And it's interesting that we're seeing that now because social media makes it possible to whip up a target of a 2 minutes hate easily, even in cases where the infraction is quite nebulous. I mean, the most famous case, one that was considered to be the progenitor of cancel culture, was the poor woman Justine Sacco, who was live tweeting a trip to South Africa. She made a bunch of jokes of dubious taste, including one which was clearly a satire on racism, but which was interpreted as racist. They couldn't tell the difference between what she was making fun of and what she was advocating. Between the time she got on the plane and the time she landed, a mob, the original tweet had gone viral. There were people gleefully anticipating how her life would be ruined when she landed, and indeed, her friends dropped her, she was fired, she couldn't check into the hotel because there were protests. So this was a case in which an utterly innocent person, maybe guilty of tasteless humor, became a target of 2 minutes hate. And I think there is a phenomenon that is due for greater attention. There was a period in which, and I consider 1984 to be part of a decade-long period in which this very phenomenon of the growing mob singling out a scapegoat for public collective punishment or denunciation was treated in a number of works of fiction. There was Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which was a thinly veiled kind of satire of the McCarthy era, but set in the era of the Salem witch trials. There was Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon, about the Stalinist show trials. Even the term show trial indicates what kind of phenomenon. There was Orwell's 2 Minutes Hate, but of course the ultimate distillation of this phenomenon was Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, in which someone was singled out by lottery to be publicly stoned by the townsfolk. One of the most famous short stories ever run in the New Yorker that kind of crystallizes the autonomous nature of the public punishment in the utter absence of any identifiable infraction. Now, I don't know why this 10-year period would lead to 4 works of fiction calling out this social dynamic. Whether, I don't know if they influenced each other or the time was right, but it is a phenomenon that social media seems to make easier and easier. And we can all think of other examples of someone who made some impolitic remark who then became the target of an online mob.
Well, if there's anyone who can answer that question about why 4 works of fiction picked up on that in the same decade, it's you, David. Do you want to take a swing at it?
No, it's the 1950s is a very peculiar and aesthetically fruitful era for all this kind of thing, because you do have these great. There is a kind of sense, certainly in the political systems. I'm afraid, obviously, I know more about what was happening in Great Britain than over here. But there is this sense there is this pronounced, pervasive sense of subterfuge, of people disguising their true opinions, sometimes for quite legitimate reasons. If you're a left-winger in the American 1950s, there were very good reasons sometimes for disguising your true views. And there is this constant sense, one sees this at the time when Orwell was writing 1984 in the late 1940s in England, especially in what we'll call higher politics. There was this sense, certainly on the left, that a lot of people just didn't know who their allies were, and didn't know who the people that they could serve with in political chambers, what they actually represented. I remember interviewing, he was still alive then, this is my second attempt at writing an Orwell biography. The first one, there were still plenty of survivors left from that period, political survivors. And I remember interviewing a politician called Michael Foot, who'd actually been leader of the British Labour Party in the early 1980s and had known Orwell. And I said to him, what was it like being a young left-wing Labour MP? in the 1940s, and he said, you spent all your time trying to work out where your colleagues stood politically. But what he meant by that was that there were at least, there were probably a couple of dozen Labour, inverted commas, democratic members of the British Parliament in the late 1940s who took their orders from the Communist Party. And Bernard Crick, who was Orwell's first biographer, was friendly with the sister of a Labour MP, quite a famous Labour MP called Ian McCardo, radical left-wing, And the sister said to Bernard Crick in the late 1940s of her brother, of course, Mick's got 2 cards. Now, what 2 cards meant was that he was a member of the Labour Party, he was a Labour MP, serving a member of the British government, a backbench member of the British government, but he took his orders from the British Communist Party in King Street. He had a Communist Party card as well, which he kept quiet of. So this sort of atmosphere, I think, obviously it poisoned the political well, and then it spread out into, into politics. And certainly a lot of English novels of the period are concerned with that. Where do people stand? Are they pretending who they really are? Are we going for this person because of something that he's done, or is it something that we think that he's done, or is it convenient for us that we think that he's done it? Because so often, as you say, it's wishing a crime upon somebody so you can have the pleasure of confounding it. But I'm surprised that theses haven't been written about this. There's obviously crying out for a PhD, I think this one. But the interesting, to go back to your original point about the Twitter hounding, it's very easy. My wife and I, who's also a writer, were having a conversation about this the other week, and we agreed with each other that 90% of the time, if a controversy comes up on, I believe it's now called X, isn't it? Well, we still call it Twitter, being old-fashioned and aggressive. But if a controversy comes up in which we take a personal interest, as writers and people interested in politics, 9 out of 10 times we don't go anywhere near it because we know what the consequences will be. And I have a friend who writes a weekly column for the Times newspaper in England who was literally hounded off Twitter. Thousands of people jumped in to say what a terrible person they thought he was. And from my vantage point, I'm too old in some ways to worry about this, but this was a young man in his late 20s with a career in front of him and a circle of friends and it was a very serious business for him, and it could have seriously damaged his career had he had less tolerant employers who were less worried about this, and it could really have ruined him, a Twitter pile-on. So from my perspective, it's very easy to be blasé about, all these kids frolicking around on Twitter. What does it matter? But if you're actually sort of down there in the fulcrum of social media, it can be a very serious business indeed.
Fantastic. So I want to make sure you all get a chance to ask questions to the panel as well. How much energy, what are your energy levels? Would you have energy for me to ask just a couple of quick questions more to the panelists first? Yeah? They look pretty energetic, don't they?
They do. They look.
So these will be slightly lighter, and we'll try to do them a little quicker. I cannot sit next to you, Steve, without asking a question to you about Orwell and language.
Yeah, so Orwell clearly was fascinated by language, and it manifests in 2 of his writings. One of them was the postscript to 1984 on the Newspeak language, and the other was the essay that we alluded to, the politics in the English language. The Newspeak appendix is fascinating, and it, like 1984, added to English vocabulary terms like crime think, double think, and the novel itself also memory hole, big brother, so on. So he was obviously a creative wordsmith. In it, he flirts with the supplement, the appendix on the Newspeak language. He flirts with a very strong version of linguistic determinism, which is to say that you can't think thoughts that your language does not have expressions for. Therefore, and the ultimate control over the minds of people in Oceania, right, was the imposition of the Newspeak language, in which he equivocates a bit. Sometimes he says that there is no need to have a word for concept like freedom because the concept no longer existed. At other times in the same essay, he said that because there is no longer a word from freedom, the thought was no longer thinkable. So he had the causation going in both directions, which is okay, but largely it was from language to thought. probably too strong because people can think thoughts for which there aren't words in the language. That's where language comes from. It's an enormous wiki of people contributing new words, expressions, jargon, borrowings, idioms, metaphors from the grassroots. If a term doesn't exist, someone could always coin one, which was also part of the problem with his essay, Politics in the English Language, which had a lot of value in it. He didn't quite have the idea that language is, by its very nature, always changing because there is no authority in charge. Ironically enough, for someone who is so committed against authoritarianism, but he seemed to believe that it would be a good thing if someone put their foot down on all the changes that these youngsters are introducing. In Politics in the English Language, too, he kind of has the arrow going in both directions, but he, I think where it's most insightful, putting aside a lot of the graybeardism, a lot of the actually grammatical illiteracy, is when he talks about, criticizes use of the passive voice in the passive voice, and that very paragraph.
Double negatives too. He hates double negatives.
He hates double negatives.
No nuance. No, it's. Yeah.
Yes, that's
Sorry,
right. He had kind of across-the-board prohibitions, which he himself flouted. But what was valuable is is his calling attention to the use of political euphemism as a way of hiding what could often be crimes against humanity. And there's a searing passage in which he gives examples of hiding of crimes under vague language. And that's one of the things, of course, that language makes possible. A lot of the essay on stylistic grounds encourages writers not to use abstractions, meta-concepts, concepts about concepts, but to stick with the concrete, the visualizable. But the indelible passage, at least in my mind, was what he says, what does it mean when they talk about rectification of frontiers or transfer of populations?
Readjustments of the food.
Readjustments of borders. Yeah. It means forcing peasants out of their homes to carry their possessions on their back, on foot, for hundreds of miles. What does pacification actually mean? It means setting huts on fire, machine gunning cattle, where he points to the way in which language, by its capacity for abstraction, can also be a tool for obfuscation of real crimes.
Yeah, I remember when I read 1984, there were a lot of things where I was nodding my head, yeah, I recognize this happening today, I recognize that. Then there were some things in the language department, which I initially thought, this is clearly not happening. And then later, I was like, wait a minute. For example, apropos the euphemisms you mentioned, we used to have in America the Department of War. No BS, that's what it does. Yeah. Then we renamed it the Department of Defense. And it's not just here.
We did that. No, we did that.
Tell me one country
today
that has a Department of War or on the Department of Offense. Everybody has only defense. That's why we have world peace, in case you didn't notice, right? And then you probably, I don't know if you saw Stanford University came out not too long ago with a list of about 100 words that you should stop using, including the word American. And they gave some alternatives. And that one, I think, eventually they withdrew because it got so ridiculed online. But
you couldn't use field, like field of study, because you see, slaves worked in fields, and if you call psychology a field or economics a field, you're calling to mind the exploitation of those slaves. I mean, it's almost beyond parody.
So this is the point where I bite my tongue. So I might think, yes. So Orwell is alive and well. Yeah. Before we take audience questions, I'll end with one very, very light-hearted question about humor itself. So didn't you, Gene, have a really funny quote about Orwell and humor?
It was me. I think it was me.
It was you, David. Yes. Yeah. Let's hear. Do you want to share it?
No, it was. I can't remember. What was this apropos? I can't really. No, we were talking about the resistance, I suppose.
I think you were talking about how you can't police jokes.
Yeah. No. Orwell being very interested in popular culture and subversive humour, made what I think is a very true remark, and something which is well worth thinking about in terms of the systems that may or may not oppress us. Which the value of humour in all this is you can't ultimately police a joke. Humour will always slip under the barriers. Orwell wrote this. There's a marvellous. We were discussing this earlier, but I don't think that America has the tradition that we have of what are called seaside postcards, saucy postcards with double entendres on them, joke, and Orwell wrote a fascinating essay about. Yeah, you have T-shirts like that, yeah. And so Orwell wrote a fascinating essay about a comic draftsman called Donald McGill, who was always getting prosecuted for obscenity in Britain in the 1930s, and he would always defend himself, and he usually got off on the grounds that because all his jokes were puns, double meanings, he could always get off by simply claiming that he hadn't known there was another meaning. So one of his most famous postcards that he got had up in court, this is 90 years ago, it's not like, it was a man going into a shop, and there's an immensely pretty girl standing behind the till. I'm sorry if anybody thinks this is sexist, but this is a joke from the 1930s, so don't cancel me for saying it. So the man says to the girl, "Excuse me, miss, do you keep stationery?" So he's like, You know this. To which the girl says, "Well, sometimes I wriggle around a bit." Anyway, he was prosecuted for this, and he simply said, the man asked, "Do you keep stationery? Do you have pens and paper and pencils in your shop?" And she misinterprets him and says, "Well, sometimes I move." So he got off, he was not, and so Orwell's view is that a joke will always evade the net which is sent to pinion it. And one way that you can, we were talking about was it the friendship cloud we were talking about? There are always ways in which you can subvert the forces that oppress you by simply making a joke that you can then claim isn't a joke. Max, you had a particularly good one, didn't you?
I used to collect this when I traveled around. That category of jokes. Like when I was traveling around in Eastern Europe, I remember they called the radioactive cloud from Chernobyl. They referred to it in Poland as the friendship cloud. It's a sort of thing, you sort of have plausible deniability.
Well, there was a rich vein of subversive humor in the former Soviet Union, such as what is the definition of capitalism? The exploitation of man by man. What is the definition of communism? The exact opposite.
Very good.
Yes, exactly. So that, I think, is a perfect segue into opening up for you. So since this is MIT and we love technology, we have some here. This, my friends, is a microphone. So if
you never get anything like this at literary events in England, what is all this? We
so
have
if you have a question, just hold up your hands. Actually, hold up both of them, because that way you can catch more easily. Okay, we start over there. And tap it once before you start to talk. Just.
All right, 1, 2, 3, testing.
I'm not sure we're getting any signal. Can you turn up the volume?
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Tap it again.
Just once.
Can you throw it to me again? We'll do a quick trip to tech support here. Maybe if I put, let's see if are you getting anything now? We're just not getting it on through this speaker. Could it be that you have a different?
Come on, this is MI-Tech. I mean,
with technology, what could possibly
we used
go
to
wrong?
say, this may be in Massachusetts, and it may be an institute.
It was probably designed at Harvard. We're still not hearing anything in our AV system here from it. So why don't we do this while we've fiddled with this?
Fix it.
You have another mic also? Just behind mic or something?
Oops, sorry.
Take it away.
All right. Well, it seems like, whether you're talking about, like hate mongering or, it seems like whether you're talking about hate mongering or censorship, it seems like there's a lot of I guess we would call it like horizontal effects, with like the friend turning on the friend, or like the mob, going after a single person. I guess my question is, like, it seems like for this to work, like whatever you're censoring or whatever you're hating, it has to be like popular in the sense that like people want to censor it or hate it. So what do you think makes like certain objects more or less desirable for censorship or hate or anything like that? I guess, like, what makes it memeable?
Usually at any time, and I don't know if Orwell would have had the same analysis, there's a set of shared moral precepts that define you as a member in good standing of a social group. So at some points in history, it might be belief in God and in scripture. At other points, it might be patriotism toward the country and belief in the righteousness of government. Now where it's a kind of social justice where you have to believe that differences among groups are the result of oppression and discrimination. But there are sacred values where merely holding an opposite belief is itself considered criminal, and the content varies with the era.
Great. We have a question over here.
Yeah, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion so far. So I was born in 1985, almost 1984, in a dictatorship back in Romania, in a very rebellious family that always got in trouble with the government. So my question is, what is the psychology of the rebel? Like in Orwell's books, the rebel always gets crushed in the end. So that's one of the things. What is what makes somebody a rebel? And are there any sort of psychological traits that can be cultivated so that more people do that? And then a little bit of a related second question is, how can you be a successful rebel? Orwell's rebels are always crushed, and the whole way in which they're crushed is very interesting in itself. But I'm wondering, if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. The Orwell's heroes and heroines are almost always, they're what I would call frightened solitaries. They're lonely people. They're people who don't fit into the world. They're people pretty much shorn of allies. Who have no one particularly to turn to, whose rebellions are pretty much initiated by themselves, who are fighting against forces that whose power they can't properly, they're not in positions of power. And what they need, what Orwell's people need, certainly to succeed, is they need allies, which they don't have. You can't just have a procession of one to succeed in an Orwell novel. Not that anybody ever does. I mean, even in Animal Farm, where there is more of a kind of communal thing, it's still the revolution fails, and you go back to square one at the end. So you need that, and I think the other thing that sorry, I'm just extrapolating from Orwell rather than your, answering in general terms. But I'm sure there are kind of general rules that probably can be extrapolated from this. The thing about Orwell's rebels is that there's a kind of self-defeating quality about them, even when they're rebelling. And you kind of know that these are kind of vain struggles in a way, and that it won't work, and that Flory at the end of Burmese Days will end up shooting himself, and Gordon Comstock in Keep the Atom District Flying will end up working at the advertising agency, and you know that he will marry the woman that he's got pregnant because he will, because society's norms are such that they will make him conform. So I think it's if Orwell's rebels were a bit less lonely and a bit less insecure and had a few more friends, they might have more of a chance. But then, of course, that's what makes them rebels in the first place. So the whole process is entirely circular.
Jean, looked like you had a quick comment there.
I mean, yes. I mean, the interesting thing as an individual is how Orwell put together his own obdurate independence, and I don't think. I mean, he's always anxious that the ideals of great social movements, as he'd seen in Barcelona when it was very free, could be used, and they would then become a justification for, that's quite interesting, become a justification for oppressing people. So I don't think there's a model except managing the system better, because these individuals can't fight these systems, and then making sure that in Orwell, people come to be rebels. They don't mean to be rebels. They just find themselves with an interior life, frankly. So lots of interior lives, lots of reading of novels, lots of thinking about other people, and then people who can re-engineer the system so it isn't necessary.
Detachment. It's their detachment that makes them do it, I think. Their detachment from the societies that they're supposed to be a part.
And those are very deep points you both make there, because, of course, the whole purpose of, a key purpose of censorship and surveillance, even hate mongering, is precisely to keep the rebels isolated, because they can't be heard because they're censored or they're surveilled, so they get caught before they can reach others. And society is divided into many, many tiny groups that all hate each other for all sorts of reasons, so they can never effectively organize. But if you want to be a successful rebel, it's good to take note that, the things that so many of you put your hand up here, almost all of you actually, were worried about. You're not alone. Look to your left, look to your right. Make some new friends shortly when we go out and have dinner out there. And maybe you can rebel more successfully. Apropos success, our wonderful friends here in the booth have fixed this. So let's do a little speed round here. Try to keep questions short, answers short, so we can fit in as many as possible.
Tap, tap. When we're talking about people who are in a position of having to serve the public good, I guess my question is, what's the difference between keeping them accountable and censoring them? And I guess, how do we differentiate between valid forms of accountability and invalid forms of censorship?
Stephen, do you want to take that one?
Well, at least in the intellectual arena, in universities and debates, no one is immune from criticism, but they ought to be immune from punishment. That is, either being silenced or suffering professional harm, like being fired or publicly shamed for the content of an opinion. But going after the content, of course, is fair game. That's the whole point of free speech. And so when people say ideas have consequences, well, they do in the sense that any idea, having been expressed, legitimately invites criticism and analysis. If ideas have consequences means you get to throw someone in jail because of the content of what they said, that's just a synonym for repression, dictatorship, totalitarianism.
Great. Let's see, we'll try to go to different parts of the room. By the way, you don't have to tap it. Just count to 3 or so, because the microphone turns itself off in flight. It has an accelerometer in it.
Thank you very much. Well, I also come from a dictatorship. I come from Venezuela, and also from the evil empire from Harvard. And I'm very interested in a thing that I find very fascinating about Orwell, that it's his, I would say, intellectual... Hello?
Yeah.
His intellectual honesty, because he was a socialist, but he was able to criticize the Soviet Union, right? Hello? Again?
Yeah.
Not working?
Keep talking.
So the question was, what do you think in his biography, in his life happened that he was able to do that? And to those professors, how do you think now we can fight against these double standards we find so much? I come from Venezuela, and for us it's very weird that I find here people that are, of course, against Trump, but almost like, I would say, apology from China, or like even communism, just because they are against Trump or things like that. And we find people from the opposite, right? Venezuelans that some way they are more soft with the criticize of authoritarianism coming from the right, because or dictators come from the left. So I wanted some reflections about that, and if there's something human inherently that we could also use as a benefit to try to fight those double standards.
Who wants to comment briefly on that in our speed round? I think. Well, you made such an eloquent statement there that I think it just sort of stands by itself. Yeah. Here. Great. So let's try to be really quick so we can fit in maybe 5 more and make sure to start with a. Oops. Make sure that it's actually a question. Yeah.
Assume this is working. I was really interested by what you were saying earlier about sort of the dangers of censoring innocuous speech, but also the fact that innocuous or vague speech can be used to disguise atrocities or to sort of soften very dangerous, like actual real harm. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how to navigate that intersection, because it seems like there's kind of some tension there.
Yeah, there can be.
Are you trying to censor him?
There are several phenomena. I think in the case of Justine Sacco, the woman who was tormented in midair, it wasn't the case of her, say, disguising an offensive opinion in a kind of dog whistle that is taking advantage of vagueness or ambiguity to hide the actual offensiveness. In her case, it was just raw irony gone wrong, and almost a perverse lack of charitability in ascribing to her an attitude that she clearly did not have, but it was just so much fun to gang on, as in a 2 Minutes Hate, that people set aside any charitable interpretation of the kind that we effortlessly make in conversation. We can't hold people to the literal meaning of words because almost every sentence is ambiguous, and conversation would be impossible unless there was a presumption of charitability. That can be then exploited, as it was in this case, although you're right that it can also be used in the dog whistle case to evade, to have plausible deniability for some message that someone is just trying to conceal.
All right, 3 more questions. So, skip first, and then you.
Hello. I'm a first-year student at MIT, and I have a student primarily for Stephen. It is my understanding that Orwell was deeply suspicious of technological progress, not just because of totalitarianism, but because he was a traditionalist and a conservative, as you talked about, who believed that pain and struggle and work was necessary for virtuousness. He was also fearful of a society like Huxley's Brave New World. So I was wondering how you respond to this as someone who's a big proponent of technological progress, and maybe also Max Tegmark, if you have any thoughts as like a long-termist.
No, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, and I know that it has been noted that in English, especially British, but also Northeast American intellectual, literary, cultural circles, there is a kind of contempt for science and technology, which C.P. Snow called attention to in his famous essays and lectures, The Two Cultures. No? You disagree? Well, he gave he called out at the time what he thought was a kind of willful disrespect combined with studied ignorance of science and technology among the literary cultural elites of late 1950s Britain. But Jean is demurring.
Well, I was going to say 2 things. Orwell had actually worked very closely in broadcasting for a couple of years in the BBC when it was broadcasting into Burma. And if you look at his letters, he's actually very well aware. He asks some very extraordinarily detailed questions about who can hear what the frequencies are, that kind of thing, as well as the sort of, as it were, politics of the audience he's listening to. So in the 1940s, broadcasting was one of the most advanced, not as advanced as it had been in the 1920s, but it was still absolutely, during the war, one of the most advanced technologies. And I don't think that he is hostile to technology. He is somewhat hostile to the use of technology as you saw it in somewhere like Russia, and to some extent actually in Nazi Germany, as allied to something like progress. So it's the co-option of technology for ideological purposes. I don't think he is. I mean, he's hopeless with he's not the kind of man you'd wanted to give a screwdriver to. But I think you have to put that back into that period.
Yes,
so
you
I
do.
don't think I slightly disagree with Stephen. I don't think he was hostile. He was saying it was used as kind of, Russian, Soviet, progress when it was being used for the opposite.
If I could just say,
yeah, that was such an interesting question. You can tell you hit the jackpot here. So we're almost out of time, but you have a quick...
No, I was just going to say, we're talking about Orwell and technology. When he worked at the BBC, apparently the first week he was there, he discovered that they had a special effects department. And he's supposed to have rung up the person in charge and said, could you send round a good mixed lot? So in other words, he had no idea what special effects were. He just thought he wanted to try some out with a good mixed lot.
That's wonderful. And since you mentioned me there, I'll just say, of course, we have the T for technology on your shirt there. I love technology, obviously, but it's very important to remember that technology is not morally good, nor is it evil, as Jean very correctly pointed out. Right? Technology is a tool, and we can use it for good things, we can use it for bad things. Fire can keep our building warm right now. In fact, it is kept warm by fire, but you can also use it for arson and all sorts of nasty stuff. And right now we're having a lot of societal soul searching about the technology of artificial intelligence, which you can use to cure cancer and all sorts of great stuff, or to create a dystopian future. So this is a question you should all ask yourselves, those of you here who work with technology. Don't just be a passive bystander saying, oh, what this is used for is someone else's department. I'm not going to pay attention to that. Pay attention to how it's going to be used and have influence over how it's used to make sure it's being used for good. So we will do one last question, and then you can ask lots more questions over all the nice food that's waiting for you out there. So it's going to be yours. Nice catch.
Nice throw. Thank you all for a wonderful discussion. I want to ask you about the distinction between government censorship and, let's call it, community or private censorship. I think this often gets elided. I think you all actually elided it a little bit. And I'm curious whether you think Orwell has anything to teach, or did he have a view about the difference between communities censoring versus the power of the state censoring in one way or the other that we might learn something from?
That's an interesting question. I suppose, looking at it from the point of view of living in a Western democracy, state censorship, the kind that people that used to be exercised perhaps in Britain, censorship, we had an Obscene Publications Act, things like that. Very easy to evade. State sanctions outside a totalitarian regime are usually very, nimble, agile people can always jump over them or crawl underneath them.
Unless you're Julian Assange.
Well, yeah. So it's the kind of low-level suppression of instinct, I suppose. And we go back to what to me the great sort of the great truth of one of the great truths of 1984. Is that the best censorship from the state's point of view is the censorship that individuals exert on themselves. Yeah. And I think that's the censorship that we exercise on social media these days. The point I was making earlier about 90% of the time, I don't even bother to go into a Twitter controversy because I know I'm just going to get stomped on by people who've misread whatever I may have said. So that, I think, is the really powerful tool these days.
Great. Fantastic. So let's give a warm, rousing thanks to our wonderful three panelists here. It was a really, really fascinating discussion.